Hi. So I am doing my presentation on the warrior women of Dahomey. Now, I first, when was looking into what I would like to do for our research topic, I saw the Dahomey we discussed this a little bit in class, and so that kind of piqued my interest, and so I decided to look into it a little bit more. And what I discovered was that a lot of the scholarship on Dahomey is post 1800. So that made me curious about pre 1800 Dahomey. So I began to look into it a little bit more and discovered this group of women warriors in Dahomey. And so that led to questions such as, how did this group of women come to be in a position of strength and power that they were in? And was it really a social phenomenon, or were the gender roles in 18th century Dahomey different than what myself, as a modern day Westerner, would anticipate or assume them to be? And so eventually and through examination, I determined that it was clear this group was a strong force in their nation, in their state, that exceeded gender expectations, and they were influential contributors to the history of Dahomey. Now, a brief background of Dahomey history. Dahomey is in the Niger-Congo region, or was, in modern-day Benin, and this map does an excellent job demonstrating what I'm going to speak about in a minute. I am a fan of it. But the nation itself was founded in the early 1600s by the Fon people group. But it grew mostly in the 1700s under one of its early kings, King Agaja. They gained prominence by defeating nearby nations and kingdoms such as the Alada and the Waida groups, as well as the Savi kingdom. That all occurred in the 1720s and 30s, and that is demonstrated in the map, as I have mentioned. So from the left to the right, you can kind of see the different territory that they overtook, and that allowed them to control a lot of the trade routes as well as the ports, and eventually they became major players in the slave trade, and that was because of these conquests. They gained control over the coastal ports and major trade routes, which led to that. And their location of these made them very powerful in the slave trade, but also in trade among the interior of Africa as well, in goods such as ivory and oil. They also had pretty good relations with several European nations, such as the Portuguese, Dutch, and British, because of these ports as well, and that made them even more powerful. Among King Agaja's military conquests, he did try and raid the Oyo Empire and was eventually defeated by them, but because of their power and their access and control of the ports, they were treated a little bit differently, likely. They became a tributary of Oyo, meaning they had to pay tribute to them, but they were still able to maintain the domestic control of Dahomey and their ports and trades as well. So they weren't a typical tributary, but they were a tributary of Oyo. Now, the warrior group of women specifically were referred to as the Mino, which means our mothers in the Fon language. And there's several different theories as to how they began. Probably the most accepted is that they started as a group of elephant hunters known as the Beto under King Hugbatja, and that was the third king of Dahomey. So that was the mid 1600s. And then eventually, with this theory, they morphed into a king's guard and eventually into military experts. Another theory is that Queen Hangbei created them as a royal bodyguard for herself and for other queens after her. And then the third theory that I have included here was that King Agajba, first employed them majorly in his battles and military conquest attempts. It is widely agreed upon, however, that the group was a result of lower male population at the time, and this was largely due to the prevalence of the slave trade in Dahomey. It was such a large portion of their economy, and so they constantly were fighting neighboring villages and towns, trying to capture people so they could trade them in the slave trade and obtain wealth that way. It's also interesting to note that women came into this group in a variety of different ways. Some came voluntarily when, as teenagers or as older women, they volunteered for the group. Some were forced into it because they were captured in these neighboring battles with neighboring villages that I just mentioned. And some were forced into it by their own fathers or male guardians because they demonstrated that they didn't have proper conduct. They were particularly aggressive, and so the men, they weren't sure what to do with them, and so they just sent them to be a part of the Mino group. Typical gender roles in Dahomey definitely differed than what these women in the Mino group would have been expected. The Mino were not allowed to be married or have children as long as they were a part of the group. However, they were legally married to the king. They were expected to act like males, and even some of the early Europeans that interacted with them cited that these women referred to themselves as men because of their conduct. They were trained from a young age for battle. Typically, it was a strenuous vetting process if they would be allowed to join or not, and they were trained in all ways of life: physical, psychological, religious, emotional. They were trained to be indifferent towards death. They weren't afraid to die. They weren't afraid of any kind of pain or injury that they might inflict. They were reverent and obedient 100%. And that is something that is only a result of very intense training for many, many years. And this differed from the typical woman in Dahomey at the time because they were expected to get married and have children, perform womanly duties, which typically meant things that would take care of the household or her children. And they, instead of being trained for battle or to fight or to train their minds, they were trained how to best support their family or their house. So that it just differed in several ways. The Mino group had quite the reputation. They were vital members of the army and the culture. They were revered and respected by their fellow Dahomeyans. They were allowed to enter special parts of the palace that only the king and other high-ranking religious officials would enter. When walking through the streets, a small servant would walk in front of them, ringing a bell, letting people know they were coming. And the people were expected to move out of the way, bow, and not look directly at them as they walked by, as a sign of respect and reverence. Europeans were fascinated by them as well for a few different reasons. They were just in awe of their valor and strength and non-fear of battle or death or pain. And additionally, with the Western European mindset, they were just amazed that this group of women could be as powerful as they were. And many Europeans began calling them the Amazons, based off the Greek mythology. And that kind of stuck. So if you do any research for yourself, and you'll probably see that the Dahomey Amazons is what they are called frequently. These women fought valiantly and victoriously in many battles over the span of the Dahomey kingdom, and they eventually were the leaders of the army. They led the cavalry, they led people into battle, and were the first people to attack because they were so passionate. They were also responsible for attacking neighboring villages that I've already discussed to round up people to trade as slaves. And they had quite the reputation among neighboring nations and Europeans as well for their ferocity, how unyielding they were in battle, and they would demoralize their enemy by flaunting the decapitated heads of who they had defeated. So that would be very intimidating, and they did that often. Eventually, the group went extinct because in the Franco-Dahomeyan War, in the Second Franco-Dahomeyan War, which lasted from 1892 to 1894. The fighting actually was only in 1892 from January to November, but the King of Dahomey wasn't captured until 1894, and so it wasn't officially over until then. In November of 1892 is when the Dahomeyans, the Mino, were officially defeated by the French. And the French were very harsh on them and unrelenting when going after them, because they knew that these women would not give up and they would continue to fight until they really couldn't anymore, or until all of them had been defeated and died. They fought valiantly, but were officially defeated in November of 1892. Since then, there have been many recent depictions of the group. The fascination with them has not ceased. And so a few major examples are the Dormelage in the Black Panther. They are the women who fight with Black Panther and protect him and serve as the major military force of Wakanda. And then the second example is a very recent movie that just came out in the last few months, called The Woman King, and that focuses specifically on Dahomey and the women of that time. Here is a selected bibliography that I've included that were influential primary and secondary sources. And to conclude, I would like to mention that more scholarship is definitely needed in this topic, particularly when it is scholarship that's reliant on its own research and data and not relying on other works that have already been published. However, the recent pop culture depictions, I think, might cause an uptick in scholarship and research in this area, or I hope so at least. And my final thought is the women warriors of Dahomey have fascinated outsiders, and by outsiders I mean people not from Dahomey, since they were first encountered by outsiders, and that's obviously still true today. So I think understanding the group within their culture and how vital they were to their community adds to that fascination and respect that we can feel for them. And hopefully the rise in public attention from modern depictions such as the Woman King and in the Black Panther will lead to more research and discovery in their history so we can have a better understanding of them. Thank you.